So who is going to be brave enough to ask the first question or make the first comment?
Hi, I'm Christiana. I'm from Akivo, which is the Association of Chief Executives in Voluntary Organisations. So it's not really a question, sorry. It's more of a comment on something one of the other tables said around about business leaders coming into the sector, and I think that can be a benefit. So actually, it is a question. What are your thoughts on that topic? Because I think it'd be helpful for the sector to encourage people from business, from academia, from public sector. I think what we need to look for is the right skill set. And I think was it Debra who said that Stuart said that the people in the NHS have much the same values as people who are working for charities. So what's your role on? What's your thoughts on that issue?
I would like to lead off on that one. Stuart?
Yeah, sure. If you look around the average sort of dining table of chief executives of the larger voluntary organisations, which I have to do twice a year, they do come from quite a different variety of backgrounds, and it changes over time. So, for example, 15 years ago, there would have been a lot of former armed services people who were running charities. Now, not so many. Some, but not so many. You do get private sector people. There's some very prominent private sector people who are running charities. Age UK would be a particular example. Tom came from a marketing background with Saga, so there was a very close link between the two. And the characteristic of the sort of business-led earned income base of Age UK, and I think is a characteristic of Tom as a leader, and that's the sort of world that he knows. Public sector people, I think, have tended to come to the sector where the nature of the services being provided has a close parallel. So if you're running a large care organisation, you get an influx of people who have previously worked in public sector care organisations or health organisations. So it does vary quite a lot. I think there used to be a sort of move about, 10, 20 years ago, of we must grow our own timber. This was a great, we must, there must come in trainee schemes, and they've got to be they're much better if they've always been in the voluntary sector. I'm not sure that I sort of buy that. I think the voluntary sector in part is successful because it's a very eclectic mix of people. I think one of the interesting phenomena, I think, has been the rise of fundraisers going into senior management positions, and also, to a lesser extent, finance people going into chief exec positions. It never used to be a common route, but if you look at, for example, WWF have just taken a fundraiser from Save the Children. Action on Hearing Loss have taken a former finance director. In the private sector, it's very common the move from being FD to being CEO. It is not an uncommon move. It's rarer in the voluntary sector, interestingly. It may become more prominent as we get a little bit more anxious about finances. People might think, well, I think we'll have an accountant in charge. And some accountants are capable of being in charge. And I think Paul Breckle is a fantastic example of Action on Hearing Loss. I think he's a very good example of a good CEO. So I've got a sort of open mind about this. I don't think we should necessarily grow our own. I think there are opportunities for all sorts of people in the voluntary sector, and it does vary over time. In terms of the question that people raise about ethnic mix and gender mix, I think the gender mix, we've gone backwards a bit, actually, because I remember, we used to host this, we used to go to this dinner, and then we ended up hosting this dinner of chief executives of large organisations. And it used to be all men. There was one woman, Geraldine Peacock, in those days, and it was all men. And then, within about 8 years, it was all women, or 80% women, and it's gone back again now. That's quite strange. Ethnic minorities, I think we've not been very good at encouraging people into leadership roles. I can think only of two. There probably are more, but I can only think of two: Javed Khan at Bernardo's and Victor at Turning Point. Those are there may be others that I've just not got the recall, but those are the only two that I can remember coming from minority ethnic groups to run major charities.
Thanks. I think you had something to say about this, Debra.
Yeah, I just want to say, actually, so for me it's less an issue about business people in chief exec roles, and it's more there's sort of this kind of culture we have in the sector about business people on boards and business people as trustees. And as I haul up and down the country, I find that, you know, so I've got the real question about the skills mix of, you know, we've got to have a lawyer, an accountant, a marketing person. And it's like, really, you know, firstly, that's just not realistic. And inevitably, if we're all chasing the same people, we're going to get some really low quality ones. Just the fact that you have to work in... And there's this kind of sense that if you work in this story, that if you work in the private sector, you must be good. Well, you know, Fred Goodwin worked in the private sector. I rest my case. So I think there's much more a question of... it's really... It's about being... balance is just... I hate that word, really. But it's this thing about when you're actually sitting about who it is that's leading the charity. So not the chief exec, but in the sense of governance and governors and the trustees and so forth. It's about being sure that you're not jumping on the business is better bandwagon and thinking that, you know, just because someone's a business person, they're going to be a better trustee. Because the honest truth is, some of the absolutely worst trustees I've ever come across who've done the most damage in charities have been those people who are very senior, very important, and from big businesses. So I think that's something more we've got to be a bit more aware of.
Thanks very much. There's a question here at this table.
Hi, it's Rob Macmillan from the University of Birmingham Third Sector Research Centre. Very quickly, firstly, warm greetings to CVSL from Third Sector Research Centre. I wanted to ask a question for all of you, really, which is there a leadership deficit in the third sector? And if so, what is the nature of that deficit?
Siv, do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I can kick us off and you can help me. I think there isn't necessarily a leadership deficit per se, but I think the kind of leadership skills that is required of the sector just now, in particular in terms of the need for the sector to collaborate with increasingly less resources than they used to have, means that there is perhaps a need to develop collaborative leadership skills across the sector. That's not to say that there aren't people within the sector who are excellent at collaborative leadership, and I think the research that Janet and I have just done demonstrates that. But our job, therefore, is to learn from that and try and see if we can share that. I'm sure others want to kick in with. Yeah.
I would prefer to think in terms of there being an incredibly challenging context. And many people at different levels, not just the chief execs of big organisations, but small community groups that are being led where people have to find a way forward, make things happen, where the environment they face is just so challenging. And if we can help them face that environment, then that seems like a really good thing to do.
I think it's a tricky one for us because I think the implicit in the work of the centre is a recognition that one of the justifications for its work is the notion of a deficit. And that's difficult because we don't want to be seen to be suggesting that there is a problem or that people are failing or they should have skills that they don't have. And I think there is a little bit of a thing of kind of motherhood and apple pie in the sense of we are here offering things, you know, there is the opportunity to take them. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're saying there is a major problem. We don't, going back to research, we don't actually have the research evidence to back that up very strongly, as I'm sure you will agree. So I think there's a case there for doing more research on that as we go along to kind of build a better picture of whether there are particular deficits, you know, in particular areas. And I think we are beginning to get a better feel for that. In issues like trustees, which has come up time and time again and has come up in a lot of the engagement work we've been doing. And I think that would repay further research. He would say that, wouldn't he?
I don't think there's a leadership deficit. I think there's a deficit of leadership development in some areas. So I used to, you know, people think, oh, the leaders of today, they'll be done tomorrow. Where are they? And you look around, there's some bloody good emerging leaders in this sector. You know, there's some elder people who should be shuffling off the perch like me, but there are some really, I think, outstanding leaders emerging from the sector. Some of whom are already running organisations of scale. Some of whom are engaged in community organisations. Some of whom are emerging. You know, I could reel them off actually. The Julie Bentleys, the Matt Hydes, the Mike Adamsons. These are people who really know their stuff, they know how to collaborate, they know how to, they are distributive leaders, whatever that means. they're a different breed of leader with a different breed of style than the heroic leaders that I came to know and love. I feel like I'm stuck between heroic leaders who were older than me and distributive leaders that were younger than me. So God knows where. But I mentioned this where there are bits missing. And I tell you where I think I've said this so many times, but where I think there's something missing in leadership development is not in technical skills. I mean, you can teach technical skills. I mean, you know, the MBA, get a toolkit, off you go. You know, do a net present value. Thanks very much. And you know, there's a toolkit of managerial skills, and most people get those along the way, or they're technically trained somewhere. They do an MBA, and you get it, you know, somewhere along the road, and you know, you've got to have that ability. I think the real issue is about moral compasses and leadership, because I think some of the dilemmas that leaders are faced with, you know, at the most senior levels in organisations on whatever scale, actually, are moral questions about how you make decisions where there isn't a perfect answer, but that actually you're making quite difficult judgment calls about this against that. You know, it's interesting. Take the fundraising stuff. I won't dwell on it, but it was an interesting question about leadership at some point, that actually people were prepared to, for the sake of beneficiaries, that was the justification, to generate more and more income from fewer and fewer people, and nobody asked any serious moral questions about what that actually meant. Now, because of the press exposure, they are asking some serious moral questions and about moral compasses. And interestingly, so people often ask, you know, what are the leadership development of for people who've sort of done the MBA, have got the toolkit, and off they go. One of the most interesting courses I ever did in my career, I did quite late, and that was what's called the Aspen Seminar, mainly because you get a chance to go to Colorado. It's quite nice. But it's a 1 week thing where you get a lot of readings across, you know, from Socrates to Martin Luther King, and you interrogate these readings in a Socratic way in a group of about 20 or 30 people, and you start to try and understand what the good, what the public good is, what being a moral leader actually means. And I thought it was quite interesting, and I got the chance to play Tiresias and Antigone in the middle, which was great.
Just really quickly, I just want to say, I don't think there's a leadership deficit, but I do think there's an activism deficit. I do think that somehow or other we've lost that kind of drive and that burning speaking out. In other words, the leadership of activism as opposed to leadership of organisations, or, you know, where are our young activists or even our old activists? I think that's where we've got a challenge.
Thank you.
Hi, Louise Drake from Claw Social Leadership. So this is probably for the guys at the centre. You've talked about what the centre will do, what it aims to do and how it aims to do it. But I wanted to know kind of how you see the centre affecting change. And I guess by that I mean, how do you know it's working, or what does success look like for you?
Do I have to start? I think that's a very good question. I mean, we do really need to have a good think about what success is going to look like 3 years from now. I think partly we might be able to answer some of that through our leadership panel, the leadership panel that James talked about earlier, which will give us a sense of whether we understand what the challenges are out there and whether we can respond to those challenges through our research and through our online modules in a way so that we get a different response. So this is the beauty of being able to have 3 years to actually do that. So I guess that would be a sort of partly a success for us. I think also the way in which we are able to engage with you and what comes out of the kind of conversations that we're having today and what happens after this will also be evidence of success. I guess if we are still here 4 years from now, that's also a measure of success. So we need to think about this, I suppose. But at the moment, we are really just trying to get a sense of what the needs are in the sector and to think about how we can respond best.
For me, I think the courses are really important within that mix. So there is partly the sense that people are taking up those courses, taking up those opportunities to engage with the courses, completing them and getting something out of them. But I think the opportunity to have a bit more interactivity around these courses is really important to definitely to gather the feedback through that process of how people are finding them, what they're gaining from them, and where they've progressed to through that process. So I think for me it's really important that we are tracking that process and seeing the outcomes that people gain through those courses as well, and also building on the courses as we go along.
Thank you. I think we've got time for just one more question. So who's going to be most enthusiastic in getting my attention? Young lady here.
Hi, I'm Lou from Local Giving. I basically wanted to ask a question about some of the things that Debra has been talking about in terms of lack of activism in the sector, and also some things that we've discussed on this table during the session. It seems that one of the key problems facing leaders in the sector is how to balance the need for financial sustainability with the core values or charitable objectives of the organisation. And it seems that because there's now a culture of more contracts or restricted funding from grants, that funders are very much not listening to charities and they're putting their own objectives onto a situation which leads to mission drift. So my question really is, how can we facilitate better conversations and communication between funders, whether that's government or grant-making organisations, and the actual charities themselves who are delivering services, so that the objectives are aligned, which means that we don't have this mission drift and we have a sector that works more effectively, I suppose.
Shall I go? Yeah. Again, another really good question. To be honest, I always come back to own the problem. I think that what's actually happened is, over time, completely understandably, and I know we've got people in the room who know a lot about organisational development, but I think what's happened is that financial sustainability has become a euphemism for staying in business as a charity. And I think that what quite a lot of charities have done, completely understandably, is they've become about survival rather than about what we're there to do. And in some ways, I think that actually the situation we've been in the last few years, I know I'll get shot for saying it, but has actually done us a lot of good as the charities, because lots of us have had to go back to saying, what is the point of us? What are we actually here for? And I think that the starting point has to be, are we really sure that we are here delivering for our beneficiaries against our charitable objects, because that's what we were set up to do? Or are we saying, oh, look, there's a pot of money over there, let's go for it because we qualify for that? One of my favourite charities is a charity called Bulldog Rescue and Rehoming. They have turnover about £25,000 a year. They don't really have any full-time staff. I think the chief exec gets about 60 quid a week or something towards the phone bill. Everything is done through volunteers across the country. They do not want to be Bulldog and Budgerigar Rescue and Rehoming because there's a pot of money for Budgerigars. Do you see what I mean? So I actually think it's a broader, deeper question. Broader, if you can be broad and deep at the same time. It's much more important than that. It's more about... And actually, I think trustees are hugely responsible here, because you get, I mean, forgive me, but it's sort of a bit of a macho paradigm. It's because success is about how big you are, or how large your reserves are, or whether you're growing. And I would say in the voluntary sector, that is not what success is. That is absolutely not what success is. Success is, are you delivering against your charitable objects in service of your beneficiaries? And the nature of funding in the sector is such that half the time it's sheer luck. Once you get past the funding application, you're into the grants committee. Whether you get a grant or not has got nothing at all to do with how good you are as a charity, and everything to do with what happens to be the prevailing conversation in the room at the time. So, in fact, Stuart and I spoke about this before. Even NCVO itself has gone up and down in terms of revenue. That's not how they measure their success. They know that there's a different measure. So, it's not quite answered your question, but I think it's about, what are we actually here to do?
But I think there's, just relating back to the funding question, I think there's a parallel universe in the non-profit sector, that we are not necessarily thinking sufficiently about. And that's the growth, and that's where a lot of activism is taking place. We have, if you like, a formal sector which is organised, which has audit committees and has contracts and is about service delivery. But increasingly we're seeing the growth of, for another word, are called network non-profits, which are people coming together in a very different way in order to achieve particular objectives. And that's in part driven by social media. It's in part driven by the way in which younger people are engaging. They really do not want to spend Tuesday afternoon in an audit committee. But they are interested in activism. So you see, for example, 38 Degrees, which is a networked, I mean, not everybody agrees with them, or the way they do business. Certainly, I think representative democracy finds it very difficult to deal with that type of engagement, which tells you as much about representative democracy as it does about participative democracy. But you've also got things like Citizens UK. I know a bit about those because my wife is a trustee. Now, they have a formal organisation, but they're very informal and networked. And they do all sorts of things. Children in Calais camps, etc., etc. So they do loads of stuff. And they are re-engaging or engaging with the faith communities who are organised in a completely different way. I remember once they let me out in August to go and visit members. It's my treat for the year. And about 8 years ago, less than that, I don't know if you remember, there was this rather harsh issue about asylum seekers' children being taken into care because proper benefits weren't being provided for them. And I visited an asylum seekers network organisation in Leeds. And I talked to them about what they did and how they organised. It's a tiny organisation, a networked organisation. And I said, what's happening to people who are, all their benefits are being withdrawn, And the churches were organised. So the synagogues, the mosques, and the church, and the Christian churches, were taking people into their homes. The congregations were taking people into their homes. This is the only way that they could survive. And there's these huge networks out there of people organising in very different ways. And we tend to, in our discussions about leadership and management, so I fall into this trap. We think about organisational forms in relatively formal organisational form sort of way. But actually, there's an enormous amount of leadership and activism taking place out with these organisations. And one of the interesting measures of success, I would hazard, certainly with you on trustees, I think we've got to do a lot more about the engagement of trustees in terms that they want and in terms that they can cope with, in terms of time more than anything else. But, how do you reach these more informal organisations, which are possibly the voluntary organisations of the future, and possibly this is where we all came from in the first place. We didn't all start with £400 million turnover and delivering the work programme. People started from. It's very interesting to look at the origins of organisations, where they came from, how they organised, and a lot of the organisations of the future will be the networks of the current environment. And I just think there is another part of this sector, very informal, they become organisations quite quickly, but they're quite networked organisations with very different forms of engagement. And I think we just need to think about that a little bit.